All right, we are on the YouTube and have some folks here today. Glad to get back to our study on the book of Acts. We are this week looking at chapter 18 of the book of Acts. Welcome to anybody who's watching by way of YouTube today and who will pick up on it later on at some other point in time. We're glad that you're taking advantage of that opportunity to join us for Bible study here at Marion Baptist Church. We are in chapter 18. And chapter 18, just the overview of it, we continue on. Paul's in the middle of his second missionary journey. If you've got your map with you, you can see we left off last week in Athens. And if you follow those arrows that are on your map, you will see that trek, that journey. And last week we talked about Paul in Athens, talked about his famous sermon on the Areopagus. Again, that's the mount. It was dedicated to one of the Greek gods, and it was a place, a hall, a forum where the discussion of ideas was held before some group of scholars or some group of elite, sophisticated philosopher type of men, and it was a place to bring new ideas forward and to give them a hearing and to let them be critiqued by this council of men. So it was much like a university is supposed to be in this day and age, not always still the same way, but that's kind of the idea that was present there. We talked last week about how in Athens they were always wanting to hear something new, always wanting to discuss new ideas and always wanting to pit new ideas against old ideas and figure out, they were searching for the truth, but probably were more invested in the searching part of that than necessarily in the truth part of that. And anyway, Paul, when he was in Athens walking around, noticed all the idols around, and that inspired him to preach that sermon where he came at the gospel. He presented the gospel in a new sort of way to respond to the Athenian mindset. And so we saw an example of that last week in that sermon from chapter 17. At the end of that first time that he preaches, it is said that he is asked to come back and preach again. We're not told if he does that. We don't know how much longer he spent in Athens. After that scene closes, we start with what we have in verse 1 of chapter 18, which tells us that he goes on to Corinth. So we don't know anything else about what happened in Athens. We don't know anything about missionary work that continued on there. We're not told anything here in the text about that. Pick up in verse 1 of chapter 18. We're going to read through those first 17 verses and then come back and talk about them. Chapter 18, we're just going to hear kind of a straightforward travel monologue. I mean, we're just getting the facts of things that go. We have a couple of stories elaborated upon. We get to meet some new characters in the story of the gospel mission. But it's pretty straightforward stuff. Not any real teaching on view here. A few things that happened along the way. A lot of it being similar to what we've seen in the past. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And again, on your map, you can see how close they are, and you can see how natural that journey would have been. There in Corinth, he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, that was the emperor, had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade as Aquila, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, remember last week Paul's in Athens waiting while Paul and Silas stayed in Thessalonica. Paul was in Athens, and they were supposed to catch up with him somewhere along the way. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. So Paul heads from Athens to Corinth, and there he meets up with Aquila and Priscilla. You've heard of them. You'll hear of them again at the end of the chapter. They have come to Corinth from Rome. They were part of the expulsion of the Jews in Rome in roughly 49 A.D. Claudius, the ruler at that time, had sent them out because there was so much disturbance in the Jewish community in Rome. Most likely, this was about the church making inroads in Rome, and again, doing the same thing in Rome that they do everywhere else, going into the synagogues, preaching Christ, and then having all these fierce debates about it. And as we've seen with Paul, we can imagine happened in Rome as well, that the missionaries for Christ are being persecuted. They're being brought before the tribunals, and it's raising up people against people in the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community. Again, there would be, if what happened in Rome was happening everywhere else, some of the Jews in those synagogues were believing in Jesus. Some of the God-fearers who were worshiping alongside the Jews in the synagogues would have believed in Jesus, and the Jewish leadership would have gotten upset about this and would have tried to persecute the missionaries and those believers. And so, as we see even here in this story, what happens a little bit later on, you've got this constant conflict going on. And so if in Rome, that's probably what happened. That's probably what caused Claudius to say, "All right, all of y'all get out of town. Just get out of here. If you can't behave, leave." It's very parental, but pretty much what it was. And so anyway, Priscilla and Aquila were most likely already members of the church. There's nothing said in the text that Paul brought them to the Lord when he meets them there in Corinth. And they already seem to be connected to the other believers in Corinth fairly quickly. So more than likely, they were already believers. They were probably active in the church in Rome. And when all the Jews were expelled, they were expelled. Remember, the church is primarily a Jewish institution still, even as it's embracing the Gentile world. You still have a fair to large number of believers who are of Jewish descent. So they get displaced, and they go to Corinth, and that's where they meet up with Paul. Paul encounters them somehow or another, meets up with them, finds out that Aquila is also a tent maker or a leather worker, and that's good for Paul because that's how Paul supports his ministry. And in doing that, Paul is being a very good scribe or rabbi. In the Jewish world of that day, the scribes and rabbis were bivocational. They studied the law and they did all their teaching and that type of work on the side. They were supposed to support themselves. And so that part of Paul's Jewish heritage still stuck with him. As we know from his letters, he continued in this way because he didn't want to give anybody any reason to discredit his ministry. He didn't want to, start receiving money from the church and being supported by it. He did receive some money from the church. He received gifts from the church, but he didn't, quote unquote, receive a salary from the church. And he didn't want to start doing that because he knew some of his enemies in the church would say, look, he's just doing this for the money. He's in it for the money. And again, because these churches had Jewish elements in them, if you were a true scribe or true rabbi, you made your money from some other means. You taught the law of God out of love for the law of God. And so Paul doesn't want to invite anybody to take that up. At the same time, though, as you know from his letters as well, Paul did not discourage the church from supporting the work of the ministry. In a couple of places he talks about that and how the church should take care of the ministers and should pay for them and should provide for their living. And if they do really well, they should be compensated for that and that kind of stuff. So it's not that Paul was against that. He just had held on to that part of his tradition so as to not to discredit the preaching of his gospel in any sort of way. He didn't want anybody to think he was in it for the money. Back up for a second and think about Corinth. I wrote about that in that first little paragraph there on that second page. Corinth was a pretty vital city at the time that Paul was there. If you have your map, you can see that Corinth actually exists on a land bridge. There's a little piece of land. If you look southwest of Athens, there's a piece of land that you cross over. In the Peloponnese is what that body mass is south of Greece. And so there's a landmass connecting the Peloponnese with Greece, the southern part of Greece. And Corinth is located right there, pretty much on that. Corinth had been a very prosperous city at one point early on, but in 146 BC it was leveled to the ground because there was some anti-Roman sentiment in the city among its leadership, and so it had been attacked and decimated and leveled to the ground. It rose back up pretty quickly to prominence. Again, its location gave it access from both the east and the west on sea, from the north and south on land. And so it was on the trade route, main traffic route. And it was a pretty robust city in Paul's day. It had been made by Julius Caesar in 27 an administrative seat for the province of Achaia. And again, if you have that map that I'd handed out to you, see that whole of that area is called Achaia. It's kind of somewhat centrally located, I guess, or at least it has good. Again, it's on a major travel route, and so it would be easily accessible for a lot of folks from a lot of different directions. So it's a fairly noteworthy city, prominent city, and an important city in that day. It was also known for its sexual license. Evidently, it was a really wild and bawdy town. Anything and everything went. And this helps us to see when we read in 1 Corinthians, Paul has to deal with sexual immorality in the church. And I think it's chapter 5, he talks about it, and he says, there's some things being done here that, aren't being done anywhere. I mean, it's really, really bad here. Some members in the church who are doing some things that are really unseemly when it comes to the church's sexual ethic. They come by it honestly. It's in the DNA of the city, evidently. It was a pretty sensual, sexually licentious town. So we get to hear about Priscilla and Aquila. We're going to hear more about them at the end of the chapter, and we get caught up on Paul and the way he's supporting himself in his ministry. And Paul takes on the same course of action that he does everywhere when he comes into a town. He goes to the synagogue and starts preaching. And he wins some converts, and he makes some enemies. So two sides of the same coin. You make some friends, and you make some enemies. You bring people to Christ, and you upset Satan, and you feel Satan's wrath. And that's what happens here. Luke is going to tell us about one of those instances. the last portion of this chapter, but he inserts first that Paul has a vision, and in that vision, God assures him that he will protect him. Keep doing what you're doing. Basically, stay here and minister for a while. I will protect you. I will watch over you. And so Paul will end up staying in Corinth for a year and a half. On verses 12 through 17, the story is told of how the enemies try to take out Paul. And again, it's nothing new. We've seen this in every other instance along the way in his journey. His journeys, what happened in the past is happening in the present for him. There was a new person headed up, a governor type of individual, Gallio, in Achaia. He was obviously, because of Corinth being the main administrative seat for Achaia, Gallio was there in Corinth. He was stationed there. It's hard to know why the Jews think that he's the right guy to get Paul taken out. It may be that Gallio had a reputation as being a no-nonsense kind of guy, and he wasn't going to put up with any mess, any fuss, and anybody causing any trouble, he was going to kick out. It may be that he was especially favorable towards the Jewish way of seeing things, and if the Jews would come to him with a problem, he would respond fairly quickly. We don't know the political maneuvering behind the scenes, but they think that with Gallio, quote unquote, on the throne, if they bring Paul before him, he's going to take care of business, get rid of Paul, and end the problem. And so they bring Paul before him. They basically, quote unquote, arrest him, bring him before him, and they charge that he is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law. We don't know if it seems to be that they're implying that Paul is stirring up people in seditious ways, worshiping God in ways that are against the law, not necessarily the law of Moses, although that would be the Jewish understanding of things. But maybe it's murky enough to where it could be heard by Gallio as Paul stirring up people against Roman law. But anyway, they think it's their charge is going to work. They think it's going to get Gallio to act. And so Paul's getting ready. Paul stands up, gets ready to give his defense. And Gallio says, hold on. This is about your religion. I've got nothing to say about that. Y'all take care of that yourselves. I'm not going to be involved in that. And so Paul's off the hook. Now, one of his fellow believers, Sosthenes, pays for that. When they can't do anything to Paul, they do something to Sosthenes. And why Gallio doesn't say anything about them doing something to Sosthenes, I don't know. Why he just let it go, I don't know. But Sosthenes pays for Paul's being able to get out of their sights. But again, what we see, God is fulfilling his promise to Paul. He's protecting him, keeping him safe from his enemies, and preserving him as he goes about his ministry. And so Paul is in Corinth for 18 months, living there. One other thing, though, and I went past this, back early up in the first part, verse 6, as Paul is preaching the gospel and he's getting pushback from the Jews, it gets intense, and at some point, Paul does that famous shake the dust off your clothes act. And you know what that's about. That's a way of saying, I don't want anything to do with y'all. I'm shaking the dust off my clothes, off my feet. And he goes further to say, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. This is a significant moment for Paul when he turns away from intentionally preaching to the Jews to preaching to the Gentiles in Corinth. He's received such ugly pushback from the Jews that he decides he can't do anything more in the synagogue. This prophetic act is really what it is worth thinking about for just a moment. This act, this verse, reminds us of our responsibility to preach the gospel to the world. Those are strong words for Paul to say to them. Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. This pushes us back in the prophetic tradition to Ezekiel. The idea being that God sends the prophet to warn his people about their sinful behavior and to change their behavior. And it's the responsibility of the prophet to tell the people that they have sinned and that they need to repent. If they repent, then that's good. Everything's worked out the way God intended. If they don't, it's on them. They've heard the word of judgment, but they haven't responded to it, so it's their own fault. But if the prophet doesn't go and tell the people that they are sinners and that they need to change, then God holds the prophet accountable. In chapter 3, verse 16, 17, mortals, I have made you a sentinel for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. This is God speaking to the prophet. If I say to the wicked, you surely shall die, and you give them no warning or speak to warn the wicked from, or don't speak to warn the wicked from their wicked ways in order to save their life, those wicked persons shall die for their iniquity, but their blood I will require on your hand. But if you warn the wicked and they do not turn from their wickedness or from their wicked ways, they shall die for their iniquity, but you will have saved your life. In other words, God is telling the prophet, it's your responsibility to tell the sinner that he's a sinner. It's not your responsibility that he turn from his sin, but it is your responsibility to warn the sinful of coming judgment. And that's what Paul is saying here. Your blood be on your own heads. I told you about Jesus. I told you about the Messiah, but you won't turn. So it's your problem now. I've done my part. It's on you now. Well, that word, I think, extends to us as the Church of Jesus Christ. It's our calling to warn the world about the coming judgment of God. Whether the world responds to the gospel positively or negatively is not our responsibility. But our responsibility is to make sure that the world hears about Jesus Christ. All right. We go to the next section of passages, scripture passage. Speaking about Corinth, verse 18 picks up this way. After staying there for a considerable time, Paul said farewell to the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. He's heading home, in other words. At Cenchreae, he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. I couldn't help but think of Richard when I read that line. And, when they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but first he himself went into the synagogue and had a discussion with the Jews. The they he's talking about, Priscilla and Aquila. Remember, they are accompanying Paul on his return home, and he leaves them in Ephesus. Verse 20, when they asked him to stay longer, the Jews in the synagogue, he declined, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from place to place through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all of the disciples. What's happening here is that the second missionary journey is coming to an end, and the third one is beginning. When he returns to Caesarea, and you can look on your maps, and you will see Caesarea is there on the coast, and you see that's where Paul ends up. He's back in Syria. That territory is Syria. He ends up in Caesarea, and then he goes from Caesarea down to Jerusalem to report. I put in their file his report to the higher-ups in Jerusalem to tell them what happened, how things went in his journeys, what advances the gospel made, that type of stuff. And then from Jerusalem, he heads up to Antioch. Antioch is his home church. Remember, he helped to found Antioch, or he got in on the initial stages of Antioch's being made a church. Other people actually were responsible for the gospel being planted there, but Paul came early on with Barnabas, and they ministered in the church and built the church up, and that was the first Gentile-oriented church. And so Paul returns to Antioch, we could say, for some R&R, rest and relaxation. But he goes to Jerusalem first. I think that's noteworthy. Paul always wants to defer to the authority over him, and he sees the church at Jerusalem as an authority over him. Jerusalem is the mother church. Antioch is his home church. Jerusalem is the mother church. Jerusalem is the church, where it is where the church first started, Pentecost Sunday, and so he's paying homage to Jerusalem as the home church, and he's keeping them abreast of all his ministry activity. Remember back in chapter 15 when they had the whole discussion about whether Gentiles, believers, had to be made to embrace the law of Moses, or whether they could just be welcomed into the church on the basis of their faith in Jesus Christ. That whole issue, that whole discussion, that whole debate, and the decisions that were made by James, the brother of the Lord, Jerusalem is significant, and Paul defers to Jerusalem and always comes and pays homage to Jerusalem as the mother church. That's to keep things nice, I'm sure. There's some political aspect to that, but I think he also is naturally deferring to the church because he sees it as the mother church over all the other churches. It is where the Holy Spirit gave birth to the Church of Jesus Christ. And so Paul does that. We don't know what that vow was. He goes, like I said, he goes to Cenchreae to get a haircut. He's obviously let his hair grow long, and in the Old Testament, there's that law of the Nazarite. They let their hair grow long. The whole Samson story, that's the law of Nazarite. And it was about a vow, and they couldn't drink any alcohol, and they had to be devout in so many different sorts of ways. It was a vow of holiness. We don't know what Paul's vow was about, but it is noteworthy that he took it seriously. And that reminded me, if you look in Ecclesiastes, we don't turn to Ecclesiastes a whole lot. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, right? I always have to do it in my head, I'm sorry. And the first part of it, you'll hear this. So the author of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, Koheleth, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. We ought to read this every Sunday before we get going in worship. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near, to listen is better than the sacrifice offered by fools, for they do not know how to keep from doing evil. Never be rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be quick to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you upon earth. Therefore, let your words be few. Verse 4, this is what it's all about. When you make a vow to God, do not delay fulfilling it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. And so when you come into the house of God and you make vows to God about what you're going to do and all, make sure you keep it. Well, that came to mind as I was reading this passage. Paul takes his vow seriously. Whatever it was about, he'd engaged in it, and he kept it faithfully, and evidently it had come to an end. The getting his hair cut was a sign that the vow was over and done with. So this is the end of the second journey and the beginning of the next journey. Again, verse 22, when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. So the journey's over and he's touching base with everybody and going to the home church and checking in with everyone. Verse 23, after spending some time there in Antioch, he departed and went from place to place to the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. If you see on your map, if you have that third journey map that I gave y'all, the first three journeys, you can see how he leaves from Antioch. heads up towards Cappadocia, Galatia, Phrygia. You see, we're on the next journey. Journey 3 has started. Now, I don't know, we always talk in these ways very certainly about the first journey, the second journey, the third journey. I don't think that Paul thought like that. I don't think he, okay, I'm finishing up the second journey. He was being led by God. He was being led by the Spirit. And that was his timetable. And, he probably had 20 journeys in mind. We know he had at least a journey to Spain in mind at some point. And in all those letters, he talks about wanting to get back to this place and that place. So Paul was always wanting to go from one place to the other. And the main reason he wanted to go was not just to go and catch up with everybody. He wanted to strengthen the disciples. He was concerned about the churches. He wasn't concerned just with bringing people into the faith. He was concerned with leading them into the fullness of the faith. He was concerned about them staying on the way of Jesus. He knew how tough things were in the church and in the world, and he knew that there would be temptations for the faithful to fall away from Jesus Christ. And so he was concerned that the believers would stay on course. We're going to read in a couple chapters when he leaves Ephesus. In the third journey, he spends a lot of time at Ephesus, 3 years. And when he leaves Ephesus, he says, I know that there are going to be false shepherds who come in behind me when I go. So Paul was very concerned. He was not, naive to the work of Satan in the church. Last section that we have to read, very quick little section here. It's kind of an interlude. We stop with Paul's journey for just a second, and we pick up a story about Apollos. Again, we're being introduced to new characters in chapter 18 here. That last section of Scripture, this isn't very long. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos from Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus. We're introduced to Apollos here. Apollos is from Alexandria. Alexandria is one of the great centers of civilization, of learning from the ancient world. And it was a place that heavily populated with a Jewish population. Apollos evidently was Jewish and from Alexandria, and he comes on the scene. He's the latest, newest, greatest, best preacher there ever was, evidently. He comes from Alexandria. I've given you a little paragraph there from Barclay, there at the bottom of that fourth page. Apollos came from Alexandria, where there were about 1 million Jews. So strong were they that 2 out of the 5 wards into which Alexandria was divided were Jewish. Alexandria was the city of scholars. It was especially the place where scholars believed in the allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament. That is to say, they believed that not only did the Old Testament record history, but that every recorded event had an inner meaning. It pointed to something beyond itself. Because of this, Apollos would be exceedingly useful in convincing the Jews, for he would be able to find Christ all over the Old Testament and to prove to them that the Old Testament looked forward all the time to his coming. Apollos is a pretty impressive guy, but he's got one deficit. He doesn't know about the baptism of Jesus. He only knows about the baptism of John. And so when Priscilla and Aquila hear him preach, they pull him aside and they teach him the whole of the gospel. Evidently, Apollos takes this very well, says something about Apollos, says something about the way that Priscilla and Aquila instructed him. Apollos takes it in. It doesn't dent his enthusiasm in the least. He wants to go on from Ephesus to Achaia to cross over into Greece, and he will end up in Corinth. We know from Paul's letter that his ministry in Corinth was very powerful. In fact, there were parties in the church, and some of them lined up behind Apollos. And they thought his preaching was the best thing they'd ever heard in their whole lives. And why couldn't Paul preach like Apollos? Last thing I want you to think about here, that last paragraph. Again, Priscilla and Aquila help Apollos. No small thing. Priscilla and Aquila got left in Ephesus by Paul, right? It's their church. You know human nature. It's their church. And here comes Apollos, and he is a whiz-bang kid. And so when they heard him in the synagogues preaching, and they heard him get it wrong about, or not have the baptism of Jesus involved in his preaching and teaching, they could have just said, this hotshot kid, he needs to go back to seminary. They didn't teach him everything he needed to know. He didn't learn everything he needed to know. They could have gotten all hyped up about it, but they didn't. They ministered to him. They helped to correct what was lacking in him. And they helped to make him able to do what God had called him to do. In other words, they recognized that he was a minister with extraordinary gifts. And they apparently didn't get threatened by that. That's a huge thing. I say that from my perspective here. Ego, ego, ego. I've told you a million times, and I'll tell you a million more. Ego is a huge factor in church life among ministers as well as among church people. It's a hard thing. And so the fact that Priscilla and Aquila checked their ego at the door and ministered to Apollos as he had need of it so that he could go forth and do even greater things is no small thing. Fact of the matter is that God equips all of us in different ways to carry out the work of the church. And some people he gives extraordinary gifts, and some people he gives very ordinary gifts. Every gift is important as we follow God's leading and God puts it in play where he wants it to be in play. Every gift is important. But some gifts will be more splash-worthy than other gifts. And again, there's a whole lot of trouble that comes into the life of the church overall because of our egos getting in the way. Any thoughts, questions, corrections, other things to offer today? All right, we will be focusing on Ephesus here, the ministry in Ephesus by Paul in the next week as we get going into chapter 19. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you.